her side, when suddenly his mistress appears, hurls cake in your face, and everyone, including your husband's friends, laughs at your humiliation. But they wouldn't be laughing for long. Before we begin, if you appreciate these real-life accounts of courage in the face of adversity, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. When Sarah discovered she was pregnant after years of trying, it felt like the final piece of her carefully constructed life was falling into place. Though the pregnancy hadn't been easy, with severe morning sickness through the first trimester and gestational diabetes in the second, Sarah approached motherhood with the same determined optimism she brought to everything else. By the time her 33rd birthday approached, Sarah was 8 months pregnant. Her sister Amy insisted on throwing her a celebration at Bellini's, an upscale Italian restaurant with a private dining room. Despite Sarah's protest that she was too exhausted for a party, Amy was adamant. "You deserve to be celebrated," Amy told her. "Especially now. Let people show you how much they care." Sarah relented, touched by her sister's insistence. The evening of the party arrived. Sarah wore a navy blue maternity dress she'd splurged on, one that made her feel beautiful despite the discomfort of late pregnancy. Mark had been acting distant lately, blaming work stress, but that evening he seemed attentive, helping her into the car and holding her hand as they walked into the restaurant. The private dining room at Bellini's had been transformed with silver and gold decorations, a Happy Birthday Sarah banner hanging across one wall. About 30 guests mingled around high-top tables, colleagues, neighborhood friends, family members, and several of Mark's friends from his firm, a boisterous group that had always made Sarah slightly uncomfortable with their perpetual boys' club mentality. By all appearances, it was the perfect celebration. Amy had arranged for a 3-tier cake decorated with fondant flowers that matched the nursery theme Sarah had chosen for the baby. As the night progressed, Mark clinked his glass to gather everyone's attention. "I'd like to make a toast," he announced, his voice carrying across the room as conversations quieted. "To my beautiful wife on her special day." Sarah stood beside him, blushing as the attention turned to her. Mark continued, "Sarah, you're glowing, darling. I'm the luckiest man alive to have you as my wife and soon, the mother of our child." The gathered friends and family raised their glasses in unison. To Sarah, what no one knew, what Sarah herself couldn't have imagined, was that Mark's words were a masterpiece of deception. As he spoke of luck and love, he was hiding a secret that was about to explode into the open in the most devastating way possible. Amy handed Sarah the cake knife, a silver-plated heirloom that had belonged to their grandmother. Mark placed his hand over Sarah's as they positioned the knife over the top tier, a picture-perfect moment that Amy captured on her phone. Sarah smiled, feeling a flutter of movement from the baby, as if her unborn child was participating in the celebration. That's when the private dining room door swung open. The woman who entered was a stranger to Sarah. She was younger, perhaps 28, with glossy dark hair that fell past her shoulders and a fitted red dress that emphasized her slim figure. Everything about her radiated confidence as she surveyed the room with cool detachment. The conversation died immediately. In the sudden silence, the woman's high heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor as she walked toward the center of the room. Sarah noticed Mark's hand go rigid over hers. When she glanced at him, his face had drained of color. "Don't let me interrupt your family moment," the woman said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Sarah looked from the stranger to her husband, confusion clouding her features. "Mark? Who is this?" Before Mark could answer, the woman continued her approach until she stood directly across the cake table from them. "I'm Jessica," she said to Sarah, though her eyes remained fixed on Mark. "Ask your husband who I am." Mark stepped forward, positioning himself between the two women. "This isn't the place," he said quietly to Jessica. "Please leave." Jessica laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Not the place? Is that what you said when you were in my bed last night? This isn't the place?" The room collectively gasped. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her stomach, a protective gesture for her unborn child. "Mark?" Sarah's voice trembled. "What is she talking about?" Mark remained frozen, offering no defense, no denial. His silence was confirmation enough. Jessica's eyes finally shifted to Sarah, taking in her pregnant belly with obvious disdain. "He's been promising to leave you for 6 months, even after he found out about the baby." Her lip curled in disgust. "He said it wasn't his." Sarah felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. 6 months? Their child had been conceived 8 months ago, which meant Mark had started his affair shortly after learning he was going to be a father. "Is this true?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from Mark's stricken expression. Jessica didn't wait for Mark's response. In one swift motion, she reached forward, grabbed the top tier of the cake, and hurled it directly at Sarah. The cake hit Sarah square in the chest, frosting splattering across her face, hair, and the navy blue dress she'd so carefully chosen. Pieces of cake slid down her pregnant belly, leaving trails of buttercream in their wake. "Now you look as pathetic as you actually are," Jessica spat. For 3 excruciating seconds, the room was utterly silent. Sarah stood motionless, cake dripping from her hair and eyelashes, the utter humiliation of the moment surpassing even the shock of learning about her husband's betrayal. Then, from the corner table where Mark's work friend sat, a snicker broke the silence. The snicker turned into a chuckle, which gave permission for others to join in. Within moments, several guests were laughing, some from genuine amusement, others from the uncomfortable tension of the situation. Sarah looked around the room through cake-smeared eyes, taking in the laughing faces, then turned to Mark, silently pleading for him to do something, say something, defend her. But Mark remained paralyzed between his wife and his mistress, saying nothing, doing nothing. Only Amy rushed to her sister's aid, grabbing napkins from a nearby table and hurrying to Sarah's side while glaring at the laughing guests. "What is wrong with all of you?" Amy shouted, her voice cutting through the laughter. The events that followed would occur in a terrible cascade, each moment more shocking than the last. As Amy attempted to wipe cake from her sister's face, Sarah suddenly gasped, doubling over in pain. "Something's wrong," she whispered, clutching her stomach. "The baby." The laughter died instantly. Sarah's face contorted in pain as a dark stain appeared on her dress beneath the cake smears. Her water had broken, nearly a month before her due date. "Call an ambulance!" Amy screamed, supporting her sister as Sarah's knees buckled. As guests scrambled for phones, Mark finally moved toward his wife. "Honey, I'm so sorry," he began. Sarah's eyes flashed with a fury that stopped him mid-sentence. "Don't touch me," she hissed through gritted teeth. By the door, Jessica's expression had shifted from vindictive satisfaction to horror as she watched the medical emergency unfold, a consequence she clearly hadn't anticipated. Without another word, she backed out of the room and disappeared. Within minutes, paramedics arrived and rushed Sarah to Metro General Hospital. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, she locked eyes with Amy. "Don't leave me," she whispered. "I won't," Amy promised, clutching her sister's hand. "Not ever." At the hospital, doctors immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. Sarah was experiencing preterm labor complicated by signs of placental abruption, a dangerous condition where the placenta detaches from the uterine wall before delivery. The emotional and physical stress of the public humiliation had likely triggered the complication. In the waiting room, an excruciating drama played out among the family members who had followed the ambulance. Mark paced anxiously, his handsome face now haggard with worry and guilt. Sarah's parents sat huddled together, her mother crying quietly while her father stared stonily ahead, refusing to acknowledge his son-in-law's presence. Amy stood apart from them all, furiously typing on her phone. When Mark approached her, she looked up with such venom that he physically recoiled. "What are you doing?" he asked, nodding at her phone. Amy turned the screen toward him. On it was a video playing, footage she had been recording during the birthday toast and cake cutting. The video clearly showed Jessica's entrance, her accusations, the cake throwing, and most damning of all, the laughter that followed, and Mark's complete failure to defend his pregnant wife. "I was recording what I thought would be a sweet birthday memory," Amy said, her voice low and dangerous. "Instead, I captured exactly who you are, who your friends are, who that woman is." Mark's face paled further. "Amy, please, I've already sent it to Sarah's lawyer," Amy cut him off. "And if anything happens to my sister or that baby, I'm sending it to every person you know." Before Mark could respond, a doctor entered the waiting room. Everyone turned toward him, the family conflict momentarily suspended by collective concern for Sarah and her unborn child. "The stress has caused complications," the doctor explained soberly. "We're doing everything we can, but both mother and baby are in distress. We're preparing for an emergency C-section." Sarah's mother sobbed audibly. Her father finally spoke, addressing Mark directly for the first time. "If anything happens to them, you'll answer to me." As the doctor left to return to Sarah, Amy turned to Mark one final time. "This is on you," she said. "All of it." Behind the swinging doors of the operating room, Sarah lay conscious but sedated on the surgical table as doctors worked urgently to deliver her baby. The bright lights overhead seemed to pulse in rhythm with the pain radiating through her body. "Blood pressure's dropping," a nurse called out. "We need to move faster," the lead surgeon responded. "Baby showing signs of distress." Through the haze of medication and pain, Sarah could hear the urgency in their voices. A part of her registered that she should be terrified, but instead, she felt strangely detached, as if watching events unfold from a distance. The humiliation of the birthday party seemed like a distant nightmare, compared to the very real possibility of losing her child. "Stay with us, Sarah," the anesthesiologist encouraged, noticing her fading awareness. "Your baby needs you to be strong right now." Those words pierced through Sarah's mental fog. My baby needs me. The thought became her anchor as the medical team worked to save them both. In the waiting room, the tension had become unbearable. 2 hours had passed with no update. Mark sat alone in a corner, repeatedly calling Jessica, who wasn't answering, while Sarah's family huddled together on the opposite side of the room. Amy had stepped out briefly to speak with Sarah's closest friend, Rebecca, who had just arrived at the hospital after hearing the news. "Is it true?" Rebecca asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Mark's been cheating?" Amy nodded grimly. "For months, apparently. And the woman actually threw cake at Sarah while she's 8 months pregnant?" "I recorded everything," Amy confirmed, showing Rebecca a clip from the video. His work friends were laughing. Mark just stood there like a statue. Rebecca watched the video, hand over her mouth. "This is monstrous," she whispered. "How's Sarah holding up?" Amy's composure finally cracked. "We don't know. They're doing an emergency C-section. There's some kind of complication with the placenta." Rebecca pulled Amy into a fierce hug. "Sarah is the strongest person I know," she said firmly. "She'll get through this." As they embraced, a surgeon in blue scrubs entered the waiting room. Everyone immediately fell silent, turning toward him with expressions ranging from hope to dread. The surgeon's face gave nothing away as he pulled down his mask. "The baby has been delivered," he announced. "A girl, 5 pounds 3 ounces. A collective exhale filled the room. Mark stood up. "And Sarah?" he asked. The surgeon's expression tightened slightly. "Your wife experienced significant hemorrhaging during the procedure. We've stabilized her, but she's lost a lot of blood and remains in critical condition. The next 24 hours will be crucial." Sarah's mother collapsed against her husband, who addressed the surgeon. "The baby? Is she okay?" "She's premature and experiencing some respiratory difficulties, which is common at 34 weeks. She's been taken to the NICU for oxygen support and monitoring." "Can we see them?" Amy asked. "The baby, yes, though only 2 visitors in the NICU at a time. Sarah is in recovery and heavily sedated. 1 person can sit with her once she's moved to intensive care, which should be within the hour." As the surgeon left, Sarah's parents immediately declared their intention to see their granddaughter. Mark moved to follow them, but Sarah's father blocked his path. "You've done enough," he said coldly. "Stay away from my daughter and granddaughter." Mark, still in shock from the evening's events, didn't argue. He sank back into his chair as Sarah's parents followed a nurse toward the NICU. Amy approached Mark, her earlier fury now tempered by exhaustion. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you do this to her?" Mark stared at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "That's not an answer," Amy pressed. "Sarah has been nothing but loving and supportive. She was so excited about the baby. Your baby." Mark ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "It just happened. Jessica was new at the firm. We started working late hours together. Sarah was so focused on the pregnancy, always talking about the baby, making plans. So while my sister was preparing to bring your child into the world, you were sleeping with a colleague because you felt neglected?" Amy's voice dripped with contempt. "And you told this woman the baby wasn't yours? How could you say that?" Mark had no response. The magnitude of his betrayal, laid bare in Amy's succinct summary, seemed to finally hit him. "I need to make this right," he said weakly. "You can't," Amy said flatly. "Some things can't be fixed with an apology. The best thing you can do right now is leave. Sarah doesn't need the stress of seeing you when she wakes up." "She's my wife," Mark protested. "That's my daughter." "You should have remembered that before you started sleeping with Jessica," Amy replied. "Before you stood by while she assaulted your pregnant wife. Before you and your friends laughed while Sarah collapsed." Mark flinched at each accusation. "I didn't laugh," he mumbled. "No, you just did nothing, which is worse." Amy checked her phone, which had been continuously buzzing. "I'm going to check on my sister. You should know that the video is already circulating. Rebecca has connections at several news outlets, and they're very interested in the story of an investment banker whose mistress attacked his pregnant wife at her birthday party, triggering premature labor." Mark's head snapped up. "You can't release that video. It could ruin my career." Amy's laugh was without humor. "Your career? My sister almost died tonight. Your daughter is fighting for breath in the NICU, and you're worried about your job?" Without waiting for his response, Amy walked away, leaving Mark alone with the consequences of his actions beginning to unfold around him. The intensive care unit was eerily quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors. Sarah lay unconscious, her skin almost as white as the hospital sheets, multiple IVs running into her arms. Amy sat beside her, holding her sister's limp hand while scrolling through her phone with her free hand. The video had indeed gone viral. In just 3 hours, It had been shared thousands of times across multiple social media platforms. News sites were picking up the story, with headlines like "Banker's Mistress Attacks Pregnant Wife, Triggers Premature Birth, and Cake Assault Leads to Medical Emergency. Husband Stood By." Mark's investment firm was tagged in hundreds of posts, with people demanding to know if they condoned their employees' behavior. Jessica's identity had been quickly uncovered by internet sleuths who recognized her from the firm's website. Her social media accounts were being flooded with outraged comments. Amy felt a grim satisfaction at the swift public response. While she hadn't personally sent the video to news outlets, she hadn't stopped Rebecca from doing so. Sarah would need all the support she could get in the coming days, and the court of public opinion was firmly on her side. A soft moan drew Amy's attention back to her sister. Sarah's eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. "Amy?" Her voice was barely audible. "I'm here," Amy assured her, immediately setting down her phone. "You're okay. You're in the hospital." Sarah's hand weakly moved to her stomach, now conspicuously flat beneath the hospital sheet. Panic flashed in her eyes. "The baby?" she whispered urgently. "She's in the NICU. 5 pounds, 3 ounces. Mom and Dad are with her now. She needs some help breathing, but the doctors say she's strong." Relief washed over Sarah's face, followed quickly by the return of awareness about the events that had led to her hospitalization. Tears filled her eyes. "It wasn't a nightmare, was it?" she asked. "Mark, Jessica, they were real." Amy squeezed her sister's hand. "I'm so sorry, Sarah." Sarah turned her face away, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "Everyone was laughing," she said, her voice breaking. "My husband's mistress threw cake at me, and people laughed." "Not everyone," Amy corrected gently. "And those who did are facing serious consequences now." Sarah looked back at her, confusion evident through her tears. "What do you mean?" Amy hesitated, unsure if now was the time to explain about the viral video and the public outcry. Before she could decide, a nurse entered the room. "She's awake," the nurse observed with a warm smile. "That's wonderful. How are you feeling, Sarah?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," Sarah admitted weakly. "That's to be expected after what you've been through. Your doctor will be in shortly to explain everything. In the meantime, there's someone who would like to meet her mama, if you're feeling up to it." As the nurse spoke, another staff member wheeled in a clear bassinet containing a tiny bundle wrapped in a pink blanket. Despite her exhaustion and pain, Sarah immediately tried to sit up. "Careful," the nurse cautioned, adjusting the bed to a slight incline. "You have a fresh incision to protect." With practiced efficiency, the nurse lifted the tiny baby from the bassinet and gently placed her on Sarah's chest, arranging the tubes and wires that connected the newborn to a portable monitor. "She still needs oxygen support, so she can only stay for a few minutes," the nurse explained. "But skin-to-skin contact is beneficial for both of you." Sarah gazed down at her daughter's face in wonder. Despite the trauma of her birth, despite the betrayal that had preceded it, the connection was immediate and overwhelming. The baby's eyes were closed, her tiny features perfect in miniature, a cap of dark hair peeking out from under the hospital beanie. "Hello, little one," Sarah whispered, her tears now falling for an entirely different reason. "I'm your mom." Amy watched the moment with a lump in her throat. In the midst of catastrophe, this small miracle somehow made everything else recede in importance. "Have you thought of a name?" the nurse asked, checking the baby's monitors. Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving her daughter's face. "Sophia," she said softly. "It means wisdom." As Sarah bonded with her newborn daughter, Mark was facing a different kind of reality in the hospital parking lot. His phone had been exploding with notifications, calls from his boss, texts from colleagues, emails from clients who had seen the video. His parents had left 3 voicemails, each more distressed than the last. Jessica had finally returned his calls, but only to inform him that she had been placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation by the firm's HR department. She blamed him entirely, claiming he had misled her about the state of his marriage. "You told me she knew we were seeing each other," Jessica had sobbed into the phone. "You said you were separated in all but name. Now I'm being called a homewrecker and getting death threats online." Mark had no comfort to offer her. The magnitude of what they had done, what he had done, was finally sinking in. He had betrayed his pregnant wife, lied to his mistress about the state of his marriage, and when the moment of truth arrived, he had stood frozen, protecting neither woman. His phone rang again, his boss. With resignation, he answered. "Mark, I need you in my office tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp," the senior partner said without preamble. "The executive committee is convening an emergency meeting regarding your situation." "I understand," Mark replied numbly. "I've been fielding calls from clients all evening," his boss continued, anger evident in his voice. "The firm's reputation is taking a hit every time that video gets shared." "I'm sorry," Mark offered inadequately. Save it for tomorrow, his boss snapped before hanging up. Mark sat in his car, the enormity of the collapsing life he had built weighing on him. He had jeopardized his marriage, his relationship with his newborn daughter, his professional reputation, and the standing of his firm, all for an affair that had begun as a flattering distraction and evolved into an addiction to the excitement and novelty Jessica represented. As the hospital lights reflected on his windshield, Mark made a decision. He would fight to make things right. He would beg Sarah's forgiveness, promise to be a better man, a devoted father. Surely once the initial shock wore off, she would see that breaking up their family wasn't the answer. With this resolution firming his spine, Mark finally drove home to the empty house he shared with Sarah, unaware that the damage he had caused was far too extensive for simple apologies to repair. By morning, what had begun as a viral video had transformed into a full-blown social media firestorm. The hashtag #JusticeForSarah was trending nationally, with people from all walks of life expressing outrage at the treatment of a pregnant woman by her husband, his mistress, and the laughing bystanders. News vans had gathered outside the hospital, though security was keeping reporters at bay. Mark's investment firm, Bradford and Lockhart, had issued a terse statement that they were investigating the matter internally and did not condone the behavior depicted in the video. Several of Mark's clients had publicly announced they were taking their business elsewhere, unwilling to be associated with someone whose personal conduct was so clearly at odds with their corporate values. Meanwhile, in the hospital's NICU, Sarah sat in a wheelchair beside her daughter's incubator, a very different kind of media playing out on the small television mounted on the wall. A local news anchor was discussing the incident with barely concealed disgust. Sources close to the family say that both mother and baby are in stable condition this morning after the stress-induced premature delivery, the anchor reported. The husband, identified as Mark Mitchell, a senior investment manager at Bradford and Lockhart, has not issued any statement regarding the incident. Sarah's mother reached for the remote and muted the television. "You don't need to listen to this right now, sweetheart." Sarah's eyes remained fixed on her daughter, who was breathing easier this morning, according to the doctors. "It's okay, Mom. It doesn't matter anymore." Her father, who had been standing protectively near the door, scoffed. "Doesn't matter? That man humiliated you in front of everyone you know. His girlfriend assaulted you. They endangered my granddaughter's life. It absolutely matters." Sarah finally looked up, her expression calm, despite the lingering pallor of her skin. "I mean, the media coverage doesn't matter. What matters is right here." She gently stroked her finger against Sophia's tiny hand, which reflexively gripped it. "Everything else is just noise." Her parents exchanged concerned glances. Their daughter's composure seemed almost unnatural given the circumstances. The obstetrician had warned them that Sarah might experience emotional numbness as a protective mechanism against trauma. Amy entered the NICU, having just returned from Sarah's house with fresh clothes and toiletries. "Security stopped me on the way in," she reported. "Mark's trying to get in to see you and the baby. They're keeping him in the lobby for now." Sarah's calm facade cracked slightly. "I don't want to see him," she said quietly. "You don't have to," her father assured her. "I'll handle it." As he turned to leave, Sarah called after him. "Dad? No scenes, please. I just want him to go away." Her father nodded reluctantly, then went to intercept his son-in-law. In the hospital lobby, Mark sat stiffly on an uncomfortable plastic chair, a small teddy bear clutched in his hands. He had come directly from his morning meeting at the firm, where he had been placed on indefinite leave, pending a full investigation. His colleagues had averted their eyes as he cleaned out his desk, no one willing to be associated with the man whose face was being vilified across social media. When he saw Sarah's father approaching, Mark stood quickly, hope flashing across his haggard features. "Robert, thank you for coming down. I need to see Sarah and the baby. I've been trying to—" "Stop!" Robert held up a hand. "Sarah doesn't want to see you. Not now. Maybe not ever." Mark's face fell. "She can't keep me from my daughter." "Your daughter?" Robert's voice rose dangerously, drawing glances from nearby visitors. He made a visible effort to control himself. "The daughter you told your girlfriend wasn't yours? The one who was born a month early because of your actions?" "I made a terrible mistake," Mark admitted, his eyes pleading. "Many mistakes. But I love Sarah. I love our baby. I want to make things right." Robert regarded his son-in-law with cold assessment. "Mark, I've known you for 7 years. I welcomed you into our family. I trusted you with my daughter's happiness. And now I see I never really knew you at all." "People make mistakes," Mark insisted. "Sarah and I can work through this." "This wasn't a mistake. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or saying something thoughtless in anger. You carried on an affair for months, lied about your child's paternity, and stood by while your pregnant wife was publicly humiliated and went into premature labor. Those are choices, Mark. Deliberate choices that reveal your character. Mark had no response to this stark assessment. Robert continued, his voice lowering. Sarah has instructed the hospital that you're not permitted in her room. She's also contacted her lawyer. I suggest you do the same. Her lawyer? Mark echoed, stunned. It's been less than 24 hours, and in those hours, she almost died bringing your child into the world, Robert pointed out. Perhaps that has clarified her thinking about what she deserves in life. It certainly has for me. With that, Robert turned and walked back toward the elevators, leaving Mark clutching the small teddy bear in the lobby, surrounded by strangers stealing curious glances at the man they recognized from the viral video. Sarah stood at the window of her hospital room, watching as Amy pulled the car around to the front entrance. After a week of recovery for both mother and daughter, they were finally being discharged. Sophia, though still smaller than average, had demonstrated a remarkable resilience, quickly graduating from oxygen support to breathing on her own. The physical wounds from Sarah's emergency C-section were healing well, according to her doctors. The emotional wounds would take longer, but Sarah had surprised everyone, especially herself, with her clarity and resolve. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Sarah turned, expecting a nurse with discharge papers, but instead found Rebecca, her closest friend from college. "Ready for the great escape?" Rebecca asked, entering with a large gift bag. Sarah smiled, genuine warmth breaking through her reserved expression. "More than ready. Hospital food is everything they say it is." Rebecca set the bag down and embraced her friend carefully, mindful of her healing incision. "How are you really doing?" she asked, studying Sarah's face. Sarah sighed, sitting on the edge of the neatly made hospital bed. "Physically, getting better every day. Emotionally, I'm still figuring that out. It's like I'm watching someone else's life implode, except occasionally I remember it's mine." Rebecca nodded sympathetically. "That's a normal trauma response. Your brain is protecting you while you process everything." "The therapist they sent said the same thing," Sarah acknowledged. "She also said it's okay to not have all the answers right now." "Wise woman," Rebecca approved. "So what happens next?" "Mom and Dad want me to stay with them for a while, but I said no. I need to stand on my own 2 feet, figure out who I am now." Sarah's eyes drifted to the bassinet where Sophia slept peacefully. "Besides, their place is full of stairs, which isn't ideal with a newborn and a C-section." "Where will you go?" "Home for now. Mark moved most of his things out yesterday, according to Amy. He's staying at a hotel while we—" Sarah hesitated over the word, "separate." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Just separating?" Sarah's gaze hardened slightly. "For now. My lawyer advised me to take things one step at a time. First priority was getting a temporary order of protection based on Jessica's assault. Second was securing interim financial support for Sophia and me while I'm on maternity leave. Divorce is step 3. So you've decided then?" Sarah nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about that moment when Jessica was throwing accusations, and Mark just stood there. He didn't deny anything, didn't defend me, didn't even try to stop her from throwing the cake. If he couldn't protect me then, how could I ever trust him to protect Sophia?" Rebecca squeezed her friend's hand. "You're making the right choice, and you're not alone in this. Speaking of which," she reached for the gift bag she had brought. "This is from everyone at the office. We took up a collection." Sarah opened the bag to find a portable bassinet, several packages of newborn diapers, and an envelope. Inside the envelope was a card signed by dozens of her colleagues and a substantial gift card to a baby supply store. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. "This is so generous." "That's not all," Rebecca continued. "The partners have extended your maternity leave to 16 weeks, fully paid. They said to take all the time you need." Sarah was momentarily speechless. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let your friends help you," Rebecca suggested gently. "You've always been the strong one, the one who has everything under control, but even the strongest people need support sometimes." Before Sarah could respond, a nurse entered, wheeling a small cart. "Ready to go home, Mom?" she asked cheerfully. "Just need your signature on these discharge papers, and you and little Sophia are free to go." As Sarah signed the paperwork, Amy appeared in the doorway with a car seat. "Chariot awaits, milady," she announced with a dramatic bow. For the first time in what felt like ages, Sarah laughed, a genuine, spontaneous sound that seemed to surprise even her. It was a small moment of lightness in what had been the darkest week of her life, a reminder that joy could still exist alongside pain. Outside the hospital, a few persistent reporters lingered, hoping for a glimpse of the woman whose story had captivated the public imagination. Hospital security formed a protective barrier as Amy brought the car around, shielding Sarah and the baby from prying eyes and cameras. As they drove away from the hospital, Sarah gazed out the window at the city passing by. The world looked different somehow. The the colors sharper, the contrasts more defined. Or perhaps it was Sarah herself who had changed, her perception altered by the seismic shifts in her life. "You okay?" Amy asked, glancing at her sister in the rearview mirror. Sarah looked down at Sophia, sleeping peacefully in her car seat, then back up at the road ahead. "I will be," she answered, and was surprised to discover she actually believed it. Meanwhile, across town, Mark sat in the office of Bradford and Lockhart's HR director, a stern woman named Vivian, who had been with the firm for 20 years. Beside her sat Harold Bradford himself, the firm's founding partner, his expression grave. "The executive committee has concluded its review of the situation," Vivian stated formally. "Due to the serious nature of the allegations and the negative publicity affecting our client relationships, we have no choice but to terminate your employment, effective immediately." Mark had been expecting this, but the reality still hit like a physical blow. "I understand," he managed. "Your actions reflect poorly on this firm," Bradford added, his disapproval evident. "We've lost 3 major clients in the past week. Our reputation for discretion and integrity has been compromised." "What about Jessica?" Mark asked. "Is she being terminated as well?" Vivian's lips thinned. "Miss Roberts resigned yesterday. That matter is closed." Mark nodded, unsurprised. Jessica had made it clear that she wanted nothing more to do with him or the situation. Her last text had been blunt. "My life is ruined because of you. Never contact me again." "You'll receive 2 weeks severance pay," Vivian continued. "Your personal effects have been packed and are waiting with reception. Due to the sensitivity of client information, you'll be escorted from the building immediately after this meeting." It was a stunning fall from grace. Just a week ago, Mark had been on track to make partner within the next 2 years. Now he was being treated like a security risk, his career in shambles, his reputation destroyed. "Is there anything else you'd like to say?" Bradford asked, his tone suggesting there was nothing Mark could possibly say to improve the situation. Mark considered for a moment. "I'd like to apologize for the harm I've caused the firm. My personal failures shouldn't have affected Bradford and Lockhart's reputation." Bradford's expression didn't soften. "Perhaps you should have considered that before conducting an inappropriate workplace relationship and allowing it to become a public spectacle." The meeting concluded shortly after, and as promised, Mark was escorted to the lobby by security. As he carried the box containing his office belongings to his car, he couldn't help noticing the sideways glances from former colleagues who hurried past without speaking. In the span of 1 week, Mark had lost his wife, his home, his job, and his reputation. Even his parents had expressed their profound disappointment, his mother crying openly during their last phone call. The only thing he had left was his connection to Sophia, a daughter he had yet to meet, born in circumstances he could scarcely have imagined. As he drove away from the office building for the last time, Mark resolved that whatever else happened, he would fight to be a father to his child. It was the one relationship he still had a chance to build properly from the beginning. What Mark didn't yet understand was that rebuilding any part of his life would require confronting the fundamental character flaws that had led him to this point, a process that would be more difficult and painful than losing his external markers of success. 2 weeks after returning home from the hospital, Sarah sat in the elegant office of Diana Winters, widely regarded as one of the city's most formidable divorce attorneys. Sophia slept peacefully in her carrier beside Sarah's chair, oblivious to the serious discussion that would shape her future. "Let's be clear about your priorities," Diana said, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense demeanor. "What matters most to you in this divorce?" Sarah had given this considerable thought. "Financial security for Sophia and me. Primary physical custody with appropriate visitation for Mark. I won't keep him from his daughter, but I need to be the one making day-to-day decisions. And I want the house. I designed every inch of that nursery. I can't bear the thought of leaving it." Diana nodded approvingly. "All reasonable requests. Given the circumstances of your separation and the evidence we have, I believe we're in a strong position to negotiate favorable terms." "By evidence, you mean the video," Sarah clarified, her expression tightening. "Precisely. While Connecticut is a no-fault divorce state, meaning we don't have to prove misconduct to obtain a divorce, evidence of adultery in the incident at your birthday can certainly influence the court regarding property division and potentially custody arrangements." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "I hate that my humiliation has become leverage." Diana's professional demeanor softened slightly. "I understand. But remember, you didn't create this situation. Your husband made choices that led to these consequences. We're simply ensuring those consequences don't include financial hardship for you and your daughter." Sophia stirred in her carrier, making tiny sounds that Sarah had already learned to recognize as the precursors to hunger. With practiced movements, Sarah lifted her daughter and prepared to nurse her. "Is this okay?" she asked the attorney. "Of course," Diana assured her. "I have 3 children of my own. Now let's discuss our next steps. Have you and Mark communicated directly since you left the hospital?" Sarah shook her head as she settled Sophia against her breast. "Only through Amy or my parents. He sent several texts asking to see the baby, but I've told him I want all communication to go through our lawyers for now." "That's wise," Diana approved. "The restraining order against Jessica remains in place?" "Yes, though I haven't seen or heard from her since that night. According to Amy's sources, she moved back to Chicago to live with her parents after she resigned from the firm." Diana made a note in her file. "Good. One less complication. Now Mark has retained counsel, Gerald Hoffman, a respected family law attorney I've faced many times. He's requested a preliminary meeting to discuss temporary arrangements while the divorce proceeds." Sarah nodded, gently stroking Sophia's cheek as she nursed. "When?" "Next week, if you're feeling up to it. You wouldn't need to see Mark. This would be a meeting between attorneys with our respective clients in separate rooms." "That's fine," Sarah agreed. "The sooner we establish some clear boundaries, the better." Diana studied her client with professional assessment. Sarah Mitchell presented a compelling figure, a new mother still physically recovering from a traumatic birth, yet demonstrating remarkable composure and clarity. If they did end up in court, a judge would likely be sympathetic to her situation, especially with the viral video providing such damning evidence of her husband's betrayal. "There's one more thing we should discuss," Diana said carefully. "The public nature of your situation. The video has received millions of views. You've been approached for interviews, I understand." Sarah nodded reluctantly. "Several news outlets, 2 talk shows, and a documentary filmmaker. I've declined them all." "That's probably wise during pending litigation," Diana agreed. "However, you should be prepared for continued public interest. Mark's attorney may argue that the viral nature of the video has unduly prejudiced public opinion against his client." "The video only shows what actually happened," Sarah pointed out. "I didn't create or distribute it." "True, but perception matters in these cases. We'll need to be prepared to counter any argument that Mark's being unfairly villainized." Sarah laughed humorlessly. "He villainized himself when he stood by and watched his mistress assault his pregnant wife." Diana's thin smile acknowledged the point. "Indeed. We'll plan to meet again before next week's preliminary discussion. In the meantime, continue documenting any communication from Mark, and call me immediately if Jessica attempts to contact you in violation of the restraining order." As Sarah gathered her things to leave, Diana offered a final observation. "You know, many clients in your position are still in shock at this stage. Angry, vengeful, or completely overwhelmed. You seem remarkably focused." Sarah glanced down at Sophia, now asleep against her shoulder. "I don't have the luxury of falling apart. Every decision I make now affects her future." She met the attorney's gaze directly. "Besides, I wasted enough tears on Mark in the hospital. I'm done crying over someone who could hurt me so deliberately." Diana nodded approvingly. "Channel that clarity. It will serve you well in the months ahead." Across town, Mark sat in a considerably less imposing office, facing his own attorney. Gerald Hoffman was in his 60s, with the patient demeanor of someone who had seen every possible manifestation of marital discord over his 40-year career. "The preliminary meeting is set for next Wednesday," Gerald informed him. "Diana Winters is tough but fair. She'll come in with specific demands regarding temporary support and custody arrangements while the divorce proceeds." Mark leaned forward anxiously. "Will Sarah be there? I need to talk to her. Make her understand that—" Gerald held up a hand. "No, you won't see Sarah. This is a meeting between attorneys, with clients in separate rooms specifically to avoid direct confrontation at this emotional stage. And Mark, I have to be frank with you. Your position is not strong." Mark's shoulders slumped. "Because of the video?" "Partially, yes. The video presents compelling evidence of both infidelity and behavior that endangered your wife and child. But more broadly, your actions have created a narrative that's difficult to counter. You conducted an affair while your wife was pregnant. Your mistress publicly humiliated her, triggering early labor. You've lost your job as a result. These facts don't position you favorably for custody negotiations." Mark ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "So what do we do? We present you as contrite, responsible, and focused on being a good father moving forward. We acknowledge past mistakes without continuing to dwell on them. We emphasize your commitment to co-parenting effectively, despite the marriage's end." "But I don't want the marriage to end," Mark insisted. "I made a terrible mistake. I want another chance." Gerald's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Mark, you need to accept reality. Sarah has filed for divorce. Given what's transpired, reconciliation is extremely unlikely. Our focus now is on securing reasonable custody arrangements and fair financial terms. Mark slumped back in his chair, the finality of the situation sinking in. I haven't even met my daughter yet, he said quietly. That's something we'll address at the preliminary meeting, Gerald assured him. A father has rights to access his child, barring evidence that he presents a danger. Despite everything, there's no suggestion you would harm your daughter. Of course I wouldn't, Mark replied, horrified at the mere suggestion. Then we'll secure visitation rights, possibly supervised at first, but progressing to more standard arrangements as you demonstrate responsible parenting. Gerald consulted his notes. Now, regarding finances, you're currently unemployed, correct? Mark nodded glumly. I have some interviews lined up, but firms in my sector are hesitant due to the publicity. That complicates support calculations, Gerald mused. We'll need to argue that any temporary support order should be based on your realistic earning capacity in the current circumstances, not your previous salary. I'll pay whatever I need to for Sophia, Mark said quickly. I don't want Sarah to think I'm trying to shirk my responsibilities. Gerald noted this with approval. That's the right attitude. We'll aim for arrangements that are fair to all parties while you rebuild your career. As Mark left the attorney's office, his phone buzzed with a text from his mother. Your father and I would like to meet our granddaughter. Any progress? Mark sighed heavily as he typed his response. Working on it. Meeting with lawyers next week. The truth was that Mark had never felt more powerless in his adult life. His access to his own child depended on legal negotiations. His professional future was uncertain. Even his parents' relationship with their granddaughter hinged on his ability to navigate the consequences of his actions. For the first time, Mark was beginning to understand that some mistakes couldn't be fixed with charm, money, or promises to do better. Some betrayals permanently altered the landscape of trust and respect in ways that no apology could restore. As he walked to his car, Mark passed a young couple pushing a stroller, the father's arm protectively around the mother's shoulders. The simple family scene, one he had taken for granted would be part of his future, now seemed like an impossible dream. The weight of what he had lost through his own choices settled over him like a physical burden. The law offices of Winters & Associates occupied the 15th floor of a downtown high-rise with sweeping views of the city. In a conference room at the east end of the floor, Diana Winters and Gerald Hoffman sat across from each other, surrounded by legal pads and documents. Their clients waited in separate rooms, Sarah in Diana's office with Amy keeping her company, Mark in a smaller conference room accompanied by his father. Let's begin with the most pressing matters, Diana suggested, her tone businesslike. Temporary custody and support while the divorce proceeds. Gerald nodded. My client is requesting regular visitation with his daughter. He proposes initially supervised visits, progressing to unsupervised day visits as appropriate. Diana consulted her notes. My client is amenable to supervised visitation twice weekly for 2 hours, to take place at Sarah's home with her sister present as the supervisor. That's quite restrictive, Gerald observed. Mark is Sophia's father. There's no allegation he would harm the child. There is, however, significant evidence that he exercised poor judgment that endangered both mother and child, Diana countered smoothly. Sarah's priority is establishing a stable routine for a newborn who has already experienced medical challenges. Mr. Mitchell has yet to demonstrate his commitment to Sophia's well-being. Gerald frowned. How can he demonstrate commitment if he's barely allowed to see his child? By accepting initially conservative arrangements and building from there, Diana replied. This is a temporary agreement while the divorce proceeds, not the final custody determination. If your client demonstrates reliability and good judgment during supervised visits, we can revisit the terms in 60 days. Gerald made a note. I'll discuss it with my client. He moved on to the next issue. Regarding temporary support, we need to address Mr. Mitchell's current employment situation. Indeed, Diana acknowledged. While Mr. Mitchell's actions resulted in his termination, my client recognizes that it's in Sophia's best interest for her father to rebuild his career. We propose temporary support based on 75% of his previous salary for a period of 3 months, after which we would reassess based on his employment status at that time. Gerald raised his eyebrows. That's more reasonable than I expected. Diana's smile was thin. Miss Mitchell is focused on long-term stability, not short-term punishment. She recognizes that her daughter benefits from having a financially secure father. The negotiations continued for nearly 2 hours. Covering access to the family home, Mark would retrieve personal items by appointment only, medical decisions for Sophia, joint legal custody with Sarah having tie-breaking authority, and interim financial arrangements for household expenses. Finally, Diana gathered her papers. I believe we've reached preliminary agreement on all essential matters. I'll draft the temporary arrangement for your review, and pending client approval, we can proceed with formal divorce filings next month. Gerald nodded. My client still hopes for reconciliation, but understands we need to establish these temporary arrangements regardless. Diana's expression revealed nothing, though she doubted Sarah had any interest in reconciliation. I'll convey that to my client. In the meantime, shall we inform them of our progress? In Diana's office, Sarah sat stiffly on a leather sofa, trying to focus on Sophia sleeping in her carrier rather than the anxiety churning in her stomach. Amy scrolled through her phone beside her, occasionally sharing social media updates to distract her sister. Apparently, Jessica closed all her social media accounts, Amy reported. Smart move considering the death threats. Sarah winced. I don't condone that. As much as I hate what she did, threatening violence isn't the answer. You're a better person than me, Amy muttered. I'd be fine with her experiencing some consequences. She lost her job and had to move back home with her parents. Those are consequences, Sarah pointed out. Besides, Mark is the one who made vows to me, not Jessica. The door opened, and Diana entered with a satisfied expression that immediately eased some of Sarah's tension. We've reached preliminary agreements on all key points, Diana announced. Mr. Hoffman will be discussing them with Mark, but I believe the terms are quite favorable. She proceeded to outline the visitation schedule, support arrangements, and other details they had negotiated. Sarah listened carefully, nodding as each point was explained. So he'll be able to see Sophia starting next week? She clarified when Diana finished. Yes, under the supervision we discussed. Are you comfortable with that timeline? Sarah took a deep breath. Yes. It's not fair to Sophia to delay her relationship with her father because of what happened between us. Diana studied her client with approval. That's a mature perspective. For what it's worth, Mr. Hoffman conveyed that Mark still hopes for reconciliation. Sarah's expression hardened. That's not going to happen. I conveyed as much, though not in those exact words, Diana assured her. Now, I suggest you take the draft agreement home, review it carefully, and we'll finalize it by the end of the week. As Sarah and Amy prepared to leave, Diana added casually, Oh, and Sarah, you might want to know that a prominent women's magazine has contacted me. They're doing a feature on resilience after betrayal and would like to interview you. Sarah immediately shook her head. No interviews. That's your prerogative, of course, Diana acknowledged. But consider this. Right now your story is being told by that viral video and social media speculation. An interview would give you control of your own narrative. I'll think about it, Sarah conceded, though she had no intention of exposing her pain for public consumption. Meanwhile, in the small conference room, Mark listened as Gerald explained the terms they had negotiated. His father, Robert Sr., sat beside him, occasionally nodding as various points were clarified. When Gerald finished, Mark's first question was immediate. When can I see Sophia? Supervised visits can begin next week, assuming Sarah approves the agreement, Gerald confirmed. It's more restricted than we hoped for initially, but it's a starting point. Mark nodded, desperate for even this limited access to his daughter. And Sarah? Did she say anything about us? About trying again? Gerald exchanged a glance with Mark's father before answering carefully. Mark, I conveyed your interest in reconciliation, but I wouldn't characterize Miss Winter's response as encouraging. I think you need to prepare yourself for the divorce to proceed. Mark's father placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Son, you need to focus on being a good father now. That relationship is still salvageable. The marriage, he shook his head sadly. Some broken things can't be glued back together. Mark swallowed hard, fighting back unexpected tears. The finality of it was finally sinking in. His marriage was over. The life he had built with Sarah was irretrievably broken, destroyed by his own choices. All that remained was to salvage what he could from the wreckage and try to build something new. I understand, he said finally. Let's sign the agreement. I want to meet my daughter. 6 months passed with the steady rhythm that emerges when a new normal begins to take shape from chaos. Sarah had returned to work part-time, arranging a flexible schedule that allowed her to be home with Sophia 3 days a week. The divorce proceedings continued with methodical precision, each legal filing bringing her closer to the official end of her marriage. Mark had secured a new position at a smaller investment firm, taking a significant pay cut, but grateful for the opportunity to rebuild his career. His supervised visits with Sophia had progressed to unsupervised weekend time, and while his relationship with Sarah remained strictly businesslike, focused entirely on co-parenting, he had embraced his role as a father with unexpected dedication. On a crisp autumn morning, Sarah sat in her therapist's office for her bi-weekly session. Dr. Levine, a compassionate woman in her 50s, had been helping Sarah process the trauma of the past 6 months and navigate her new identity as a single mother. You seem more relaxed today, Dr. Levine observed. How are things going? Sarah settled more comfortably in the armchair. Better, I think. Sophia slept through the night 3 times this week, which feels like winning the lottery. Work is going well. They've been incredibly supportive about my schedule, and the divorce should be finalized next month. How do you feel about that milestone approaching? Sarah considered the question carefully. Relieved mostly, ready to close that chapter officially. Though sometimes I still have moments where I think, this wasn't how my life was supposed to go, especially when I see families with both parents at the park or grocery store. Dr. Levine nodded encouragingly. That's natural. You're grieving not just the end of your marriage, but the loss of the future you had envisioned. Exactly, Sarah agreed. I'm not grieving Mark anymore. That ended the moment he stood by while Jessica threw that cake, but I do sometimes grieve the life I thought we would have. And how are the co-parenting arrangements working? Sarah's expression softened. Better than expected, actually. Mark has really stepped up as a father. He's reliable with his schedule, he follows all the care instructions I send with Sophia, and he never brings up our relationship anymore. He's focused entirely on being there for her. That must be a relief, Dr. Levine noted. It is, Sarah acknowledged. I was so worried that Sophia would become a pawn in some bitter divorce battle, but Mark seems to genuinely understand that our issues shouldn't affect her relationship with him. Dr. Levine made a note in her pad. Last session we talked about the possibility of you beginning to date again. Have you given that any more thought? Sarah laughed, a genuine sound that reached her eyes. With what time? Between Sophia, work, and finalizing the divorce, I barely have time to shower, much less date. Time constraints aside, Dr. Levine pressed gently. How do you feel about the idea emotionally? Sarah's amusement faded to thoughtfulness. Honestly, I'm not ready. Not because I'm still attached to Mark, but because I'm still getting to know myself again. Who I am as Sarah, not just Mark's wife or Sophia's mother. I spent so many years defining myself through my relationship with him. I need time to figure out who I am on my own before I could possibly be good company for someone else. Dr. Levine smiled approvingly. That's a very healthy perspective. Many people rush into new relationships to fill the void left by a divorce, often with disappointing results. As the session continued, Sarah found herself reflecting on how far she had come since that disastrous birthday party. The woman who had stood frozen with cake dripping down her face, utterly humiliated in front of friends and family, seemed like a different person now, someone who had existed in another lifetime. The transformation hadn't been easy or linear. There had been dark days in the beginning, nights when Sophia would cry inconsolably, and Sarah, exhausted and alone, would cry right along with her. Times when checking the mail only to find another legal document drove home the failure of her marriage in stark black and white. Moments when the simplest tasks felt overwhelming because they had to be faced alone. But there had also been unexpected brightness. The colleague who organized a meal train, so Sarah didn't have to cook during her first weeks home with Sophia. The neighbors who took turns mowing her lawn without being asked. Amy, who had essentially moved in for the first month, providing both practical help and emotional support. And most surprisingly, the strength Sarah discovered within herself, a resilience she hadn't known she possessed until circumstance forced her to find it. After her therapy session, Sarah picked up Sophia from the daycare center, where she spent 2 days a week. At 10 months old, Sophia was a cheerful baby, with Mark's dark hair and Sarah's determined personality. She squealed with delight when she spotted her mother, pulling herself up on the playpen railing and bouncing excitedly. "There's my girl," Sarah cooed, signing in and gathering Sophia into her arms. "Did you have a good day, sweet pea?" She was a delight, as always, the daycare worker assured her. "She's really getting the hang of those wooden blocks. Quite the little engineer." Sarah beamed with pride. Every new skill Sophia developed filled her with wonder and joy, bright spots of happiness that sometimes made the difficult journey of the past year feel worthwhile, if only because it had resulted in this perfect little person. As they drove home, Sarah's phone rang through the car's Bluetooth system. Amy's name flashed on the display. "Hey, what's up?" Sarah answered. "Are you sitting down?" Amy asked, her voice vibrating with an emotion Sarah couldn't immediately identify. "I'm driving, so yes. Why? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Amy assured her quickly, "but you won't believe what just happened. Jessica Roberts reached out to me through LinkedIn." Sarah nearly missed a stop sign in her surprise. "What? Why would she contact you?" "She wants to apologize to you," Amy explained. "She sent a long message explaining that she's been in therapy, working through her issues, and part of her recovery is making amends to people she's hurt. She asked if I thought you would be willing to meet with her." Sarah was momentarily speechless. The woman who had thrown cake at her pregnant belly, triggering premature labor and nearly costing Sophia her life, wanted to apologize. "I told her I'd ask you," But no pressure either way, Amy continued when Sarah didn't immediately respond. I also said that if you did agree to meet, I'd be there with you the whole time. Sarah pulled into her driveway, her mind racing. I don't know, Amy. What would be the point? It's not like we can ever be friends. It's not about friendship, Amy pointed out. It might be about closure, for both of you. Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror at Sophia, who was contentedly chewing on a teething toy in her car seat. Let me think about it. This isn't something I want to rush into. After disconnecting from Amy, Sarah sat in her parked car for several minutes, processing this unexpected development. Jessica wanting to apologize was the last thing she would have predicted. Part of her wanted to refuse outright. Why should she give Jessica the satisfaction of easing her conscience? But another part, the part that had been working with Dr. Levine on letting go of anger that only harmed herself, wondered if hearing Jessica out might help close this chapter more completely. That evening, after putting Sophia to bed, Sarah sat on her patio with a glass of wine, contemplating the strange twists her life had taken. Her phone chimed with a text from Mark. Sophia left her favorite stuffed bunny in my car. Do you want me to drop it by tonight? Sarah texted back, no need. She has backup bunny here. You can bring it Friday for your weekend. The exchange was typical of their communication now, polite, focused on Sophia, devoid of personal connection. It was so different from the loving texts they used to send, full of inside jokes and affection. But this new business-like relationship served its purpose. They were co-parents now, not partners, and Sarah had made her peace with that. A week later, Sarah sat across from Jessica in a quiet corner of a coffee shop Amy had selected for its privacy. Amy sat protectively beside her sister, her expression making it clear she was prepared to end the meeting at the first sign of distress from Sarah. Jessica looked different than Sarah remembered. The confident, glamorous woman who had strutted into the birthday party in her red dress had been replaced by someone more subdued, dressed in simple jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Thank you for agreeing to meet me, Jessica began, her voice noticeably nervous. I honestly wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure either, Sarah admitted candidly. But I'm trying to practice what my therapist calls radical openness, being willing to engage with difficult situations instead of avoiding them. Jessica nodded, fidgeting with her coffee cup. I've been in therapy too, a lot of it. Turns out I have some pretty significant issues with seeking validation through relationships with unavailable men. She took a deep breath. But that's not why I wanted to see you. I wanted to apologize face to face for what I did that night. Sarah remained silent, waiting. What I did was inexcusable, Jessica continued. I was angry and hurt because Mark had been promising to leave you for months, and then suddenly he was acting like he wanted to make your marriage work. But that's no justification for physically attacking a pregnant woman. I put you and your baby in danger because I couldn't control my emotions, and I've had to live with that knowledge every day since. Yes, you have, Sarah agreed, her voice steady. And I've had to live with the consequences. Sophia was born a month early. She spent her first days in the NICU. We both could have died. Jessica paled visibly. I know. And there's nothing I can do to change that or make it right. All I can say is that I'm profoundly sorry, and I'm working every day to become someone who would never do something so horrible again. Amy watched the exchange with wary attention, ready to intervene if necessary, but Sarah remained calm, her composure unshaken. Can I ask you something? Sarah said after a moment. Jessica nodded. Anything? When did it start? Your relationship with Mark? Jessica hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question, but apparently committed to complete honesty. About 6 months before that night, he said things at home were strained, that you were obsessed with the pregnancy, and he felt invisible. He made me believe your marriage was essentially over in all but name. Sarah absorbed this information with a slight nod. It aligned with the timeline she had pieced together from Mark's texts and emails discovered during the divorce process. Did you know I was pregnant when you started seeing him? Jessica looked down at her hands. Yes, he told me right away. Said it was an accident, that you'd gotten pregnant despite agreement to wait. She looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes directly. Later he told me he wasn't sure the baby was his. Sarah's composure finally cracked slightly, a flash of pain crossing her features. Amy immediately placed a hand on her sister's arm in support. That was a lie, Sarah said quietly. There was never any question about Sophia's paternity, and the pregnancy was planned. We'd been trying for over a year. Jessica closed her eyes briefly. I'm not surprised. He told me a lot of things that I later realized were probably lies. Not that it excuses my behavior, she added quickly. I still chose to believe what I wanted to believe and act in a way that was unforgivable. The three women sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared history, though experienced from dramatically different perspectives, hanging between them. Finally, Sarah spoke. I appreciate your apology, Jessica. I truly do. I can't say I forgive you, at least not yet. But I can say that I hope you find peace and learn from this experience." Jessica nodded, tears filling her eyes. "That's more than I deserve. Thank you for hearing me out." As they prepared to leave, Jessica asked one final question. "How is your daughter, if you don't mind me asking?" For the first time, Sarah smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "Sophia is amazing, strong, smart, determined. Everything she does fills me with wonder." Jessica returned the smile cautiously. "She sounds wonderful. I'm glad you're both okay." The meeting ended shortly after, and as Sarah and Amy walked to their cars, Amy studied her sister closely. "You okay? That couldn't have been easy." Sarah considered the question. "Actually, I feel lighter. It doesn't change what happened, but knowing she recognizes the gravity of what she did, that she's taking responsibility, it helps somehow." Amy shook her head in amazement. "You're incredible, you know that? After everything you've been through, you still found compassion for the woman who caused so much pain?" Sarah shrugged. "It's not really about her. It's about me. What kind of person I want to be. What example I want to set for Sophia. Holding on to anger just takes energy I need for more important things." Exactly 1 year after the infamous birthday party, Sarah stood in her kitchen putting the finishing touches on a small cake, decorated with a single candle. Sophia, now 14 months old, played happily in her high chair, babbling excitedly at the colorful sprinkles her mother was adding to the frosting. The doorbell rang, and Sarah wiped her hands on a towel before going to answer it. Amy stood on the porch, arms laden with gifts and balloons. "Happy rebirthday," Amy announced, entering with her usual exuberance. Sarah laughed at her sister's enthusiasm. "You really didn't need to bring all this." "Of course I did," Amy insisted. "Today isn't just any day. It's the anniversary of you becoming the incredible woman you are now. The Sarah 2.0 release date, if you will." Sarah rolled her eyes good-naturedly as she helped Amy arrange her offerings on the dining room table. "You're ridiculous, but I love you for it." "Seriously, though," Amy said, her tone becoming earnest. "I'm so proud of how you've handled everything this past year. You've been amazing." Sarah was saved from having to respond to this praise by the arrival of more guests, Rebecca, and several other close friends who had been Sarah's support system throughout the difficult year. Each brought food, drinks, or small gifts, creating a festive atmosphere that filled the house with laughter and warmth. As Sarah lit the single candle on the cake, she addressed the gathered friends. "Thank you all for being here today. A year ago, I thought my life was ending. Literally, at one point," she smiled ruefully. "But instead, it was just beginning in a way I couldn't have imagined." Amy raised her glass. "To Sarah, who showed us all what true strength looks like." "To Sarah," the friends echoed, lifting their glasses in a toast. Sarah blushed at the attention but continued. "I've learned so much this past year. About resilience, about friendship, about what truly matters." She glanced at Sophia, who was watching the candle flame with fascinated attention. "Most of all, I've learned that sometimes what looks like the worst moment of your life can actually be the beginning of something better than you ever dreamed possible." As Sarah bent to blow out the candle, she made a silent wish, not for love or success, or any of the things she might have wished for a year ago, but for continued strength to face whatever challenges still lay ahead. Because if the past year had taught her anything, it was that she was capable of weathering storms she once would have thought impossible to survive. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and Sophia was asleep in her crib, Sarah sat alone on her patio, contemplating the stars visible through breaks in the cloud cover. Her divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier, marking the official end of her marriage to Mark. In an unexpected development, the proceedings had been less contentious than anticipated, with Mark agreeing to generous terms regarding child support and property division. The house where they had once planned to raise their family together was now solely Sarah's. She had repainted several rooms, rearranged furniture, and gradually transformed the space into something that reflected her own taste, rather than the compromises of marriage. It was a physical manifestation of the internal renovation she had undergone, rebuilding her life on her own terms. Her phone chimed with a text message. It was from David, a single father she had met in Sophia's developmental playgroup. "Just checking that we're still on for the park play date tomorrow. Logan is very excited to show Sophia his new truck." Sarah smiled as she replied in the affirmative. David was just a friend for now. Neither of them was ready for more, but his presence in her life represented possibility. The possibility that someday, when the time was right, she might open her heart again. Not to replace what was lost, but to create something new and unexpected. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. The woman who gazed back at her was different from the one who had stood frosting-covered and humiliated a year ago. This Sarah stood straighter, her eyes clearer, her expression more serene. The pain hadn't disappeared entirely. There would always be a scar where her heart had been broken, but it no longer defined her. In the nursery, Sarah paused to watch Sophia sleeping peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling in the soft glow of the nightlight. Whatever else had happened, this perfect child had emerged from the chaos. And for that, Sarah could not bring herself to regret any part of the journey that had brought them here. 1 year ago, a roomful of people had laughed as cake dripped down her pregnant belly. They had stopped laughing when she collapsed, when the gravity of their cruelty became apparent in her medical emergency. But in the end, it wasn't their laughter, or even their eventual shame that mattered. What mattered was that Sarah had discovered within herself a capacity for resilience, forgiveness, and joy that no humiliation could diminish. She had found her voice, her strength, and her purpose. And that transformation, from victim to survivor to thriver, was worth celebrating with a single candle and a wish for the future. As she turned out the light, Sarah whispered into the darkness, "Happy rebirthday to me." Sarah's journey from public humiliation to personal transformation reminds us that our darkest moments don't define us. It's how we respond to them that shapes our character and our future. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you ever experienced a moment that seemed devastating, but ultimately led to unexpected growth? How did you navigate that transformation? Share your experiences in the comments below.